Something massive just shifted in the middle of Europe, and most Americans have no idea it even happened. What you are watching right now is not just a diplomatic handshake. What you are watching is the collapse of one of the last remaining firewalls inside the European Union that was actively slowing down the Western war machine directed at Russia. Hungary, for years, was the thorn in NATO's side, the country that refused to play ball, the country that blocked EU loan packages, vetoed sanctions, and kept the Druzhba oil pipeline flowing from Russia into Central Europe. Viktor Orban ran that show for 16 straight years, and he ran it with a kind of defiant independence that made Brussels lose sleep. But on April 12, 2026, Orban lost the Hungarian election. He lost it decisively, catastrophically even, to a man named Peter Magyar, whose TISA party didn't just win, it secured a constitutional supermajority, more than two-thirds of parliament, the kind of mandate that lets a new government rewrite the rules entirely. And within days, Magyar was reaching out to Zelensky, proposing a summit in June, symbolically in a Hungarian-majority Ukrainian city called Berehov, deep in the Transcarpathia region. This is a geopolitical earthquake, and if you're someone who pays attention to how the world actually works beneath the headlines, you need to understand every layer of what is happening here, because none of it is as simple or as innocent as it's being presented. Let's start with who Peter Magyar actually is, because this matters enormously. Magyar is a former insider. He was once married to a prominent figure in the Orban government. He comes from within the Fidesz system. He is not some grassroots outsider who appeared from nowhere. He's a man who knows exactly how Hungary's political architecture was built, and he ran a campaign that successfully dismantled it from the outside in. He gathered 3.3 million votes, the highest any Hungarian party has ever received in the democratic era. People celebrated in the streets of Budapest, on the banks of the Danube, singing Queen's "We Are the Champions." Barack Obama praised the result. Emmanuel Macron praised it. The European Parliament president praised it. Ursula von der Leyen praised it. When Brussels, Washington, and the entire Western liberal establishment simultaneously celebrates the same election result, you should always pause and ask yourself a serious question. Who exactly does this outcome serve? That is not a cynical question. That is the most important analytical question you can ask about any election in today's geopolitical climate, because the answer tells you everything about where power is actually moving. Now let's talk about what changed immediately and practically. The Druzhba pipeline, the Soviet-era oil artery that runs Russian crude through Ukraine into Hungary and Slovakia, had been shut down since a Russian drone strike damaged it in western Ukraine back in late January. Orban used that shutdown to veto the €90 billion EU loan package for Ukraine. He said Hungary needs its oil, no oil means no vote, and Brussels was livid. They called it blackmail. They pressured Zelensky to fix the pipeline. Then Zelensky announced on April 21st that Ukraine had completed repairs. And just like that, by April 23rd, the pipeline was flowing again, the loan was unblocked, and the 20th package of EU sanctions against Russia was cleared. This is where you have to sit with the complexity of it, because what happened is genuinely strange if you think about it carefully. Ukraine repaired a pipeline that carries Russian oil into Europe so that Hungary would lift a veto, so that Europe could give Ukraine €90 billion to continue fighting Russia. That sentence should stop you cold. Ukraine fixed the infrastructure that profits Moscow in order to unlock money to fight Moscow. That is the kind of geopolitical contradiction that tells you this war is not being fought along clean ideological lines. There are interests within interests, and energy is always at the center. Magyar's position on all of this is revealing in ways that Western media is not fully examining. On one hand, he is clearly repositioning Hungary away from Orban's open defiance of Brussels. He is meeting Zelensky. He is talking about opening a new chapter. He is making gestures toward European solidarity. On the other hand, he told Zelensky directly at his very first international press conference that Hungary will make no concessions on the Druzhba pipeline. He compared Zelensky's demands to a dinner guest who comes over and immediately starts demanding the food be cooked a certain way. He said that is the wrong attitude. He said he would not advise acting like that. This is not the language of a man who is simply going to roll over and become Brussels' obedient satellite. Magyar is playing a more sophisticated game than Orban, and that may make him more effective and ultimately more consequential as a geopolitical actor. Orban was loud, blunt, and easy to dismiss as a Putin apologist or a provocateur. Magyar is smoother, more EU palatable, but he is still representing Hungarian national interests, and those interests include access to affordable Russian energy, protection of ethnic Hungarians in Transcarpathia, and sovereignty over Hungary's internal referendum processes. Speaking of that summit in Berehov, that detail alone is worth examining closely. Berehov is a city in western Ukraine that has a majority ethnic Hungarian population. It sits in the Zakarpattia Oblast, a region that was historically part of the Kingdom of Hungary before World War I. The Hungarians who live there have spent years in an escalating dispute with Kiev over language rights. In 2017, Ukraine passed a law making Ukrainian the mandatory language of secondary education, which Hungary argued effectively stripped tens of thousands of ethnic Hungarians of their cultural identity. Magyar's proposal to hold the summit there is not just symbolic, it is a signal. He is telling Zelensky and telling the watching world that the ethnic Hungarian question in Transcarpathia is a real and non-negotiable issue that must be addressed before the relationship between Budapest and Kyiv can genuinely normalize. He is framing it in the language of human rights and minority protection, which is the kind of framing the European Union and the Western press find very difficult to argue against. That is smart diplomacy. That is not the Orban style of blunt confrontation. That is a man who has studied the terrain and chosen his ground carefully. Now here is where it gets deeper and where you have to stretch your analytical framework beyond the day-to-day news cycle. What does this shift in Hungary actually mean for the broader architecture of power in Europe? For the past several years, Hungary, and to a lesser extent Slovakia, functioned as internal friction points within the EU's consensus machine. They could veto sanctions. They could block loan approvals. They could slow Ukraine's EU accession process. Orban, in particular, became what one analyst at Chatham House called a chronic point of friction. Moscow, whether or not it explicitly coordinated with Budapest, clearly benefited from having a member state inside the EU capable of throwing sand into the gears. That friction is now being removed. Magyar has pledged to raise Hungary's defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, which is above the NATO benchmark. His party has pledged to reduce Russian energy dependence by 2035. He wants to review the Pax nuclear project, which was largely financed and built by Russia. These are not small signals. These are structural realignments that will take years to fully materialize, but the direction is now set, and Moscow understands exactly what that direction means. There's another layer here that deserves serious attention, and it has to do with the timeline of political change across Europe. Consider what has happened in the last few years. Poland, a country that was once considered an EU dissident for its nationalist government, went through an election in 2023 that brought in a pro-Brussels coalition. Hungary has now followed the same pattern in 2026. The European conservative bloc that once had real institutional weight inside the EU, anchored by Orban's Hungary and Kaczynski's Poland, has been systematically dismantled through the electoral process. And every time one of these governments falls, the Western liberal establishment celebrates with the same language about democracy and European values. And every time, the practical result is another country moving closer to full alignment with NATO's strategic posture, Ukraine's war effort, and Brussels' economic and regulatory framework. You can believe that this is purely organic democratic expression, and there is real evidence that ordinary Hungarians were genuinely exhausted by corruption, cronyism, and Orban's increasingly erratic behavior. But you can also hold simultaneously the observation that these outcomes consistently benefit a particular set of geopolitical interests, and that the alignment between electoral results and Western strategic preferences is not random. What you are also watching is a stress test of Magyar himself. He has made promises to Brussels, to Zelensky, to his 3 million voters, and to Hungarian energy companies that depend on Russian oil. Those promises are going to conflict with each other. He has already said Hungary will hold a referendum on Ukrainian EU accession. He has already said he will not send troops to Ukraine. He has already insisted on no concessions on the pipeline, and yet he is proposing a summit with Zelensky and talking about opening a new chapter. This is a man walking a tightrope above a very complicated abyss. And the question is whether he will be able to maintain balance, or whether the pressures from Brussels on one side and Hungarian domestic interests on the other will eventually force him into contradictions he cannot survive politically. Orban was politically indestructible for 16 years, in part because he was absolutely consistent. Magyar's coalition of supporters includes pro-European liberals, disenchanted former Fidesz voters, business communities that want EU funds unlocked, and minority rights advocates. That is a much more fragile coalition to hold together, and every decision he makes about Ukraine will test it. The Zelensky factor is fascinating on its own. Zelensky greeted Magyar's election with warm congratulations and expressed hope for pragmatic and friendly relations. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha called Orban's defeat an opportunity to open a new chapter. But then details emerged suggesting that Magyar had misrepresented his prior relationship with Zelensky. Zelensky himself indicated in an interview that the two had actually met in person more than a year ago, possibly 2 years ago, and that it was Magyar who had originally requested the meeting. Magyar had publicly positioned himself as having had no real contact with Zelensky before. That kind of inconsistency does not derail a new government on its own, but it creates a texture of ambiguity around the man and his motives that will not go away. It raises the question of what kind of back-channel relationship existed between the Tiza party and Ukrainian officials during the campaign, and whether promises were made in private that differ from what is being said publicly. Then there is the broader economic equation. Hungary is landlocked. Hungary's primary oil infrastructure runs through the Druzhba pipeline. Hungary's MOL Group, the national oil company, has built its entire refining capacity around Russian crude. Changing that is not a matter of political will alone. It requires billions in infrastructure investment, years of transition, and alternative supply chains that do not yet fully exist. Magyar knows this. The EU knows this. Everyone in this negotiation knows that Hungary's energy dependency on Russia is a structural reality, not just a political preference. And yet the new government has pledged to reduce that dependency by 2035. That is a 9-year timeline, which means it falls entirely within the political life of the current government. It also means that for the next several years, Russia still has real leverage over Hungary and therefore over Hungary's behavior inside EU councils, regardless of what language is being used publicly about European solidarity and a new chapter with Ukraine. What you're watching in Hungary right now is something that plays out across history with regularity. A country pressured from within and without changes its governing coalition. The new coalition speaks the language of reform, openness, and alignment with the prevailing international order. Immediate benefits flow. EU funds get unlocked. Diplomatic relationships warm up. Western leaders applaud. And then the hard work of actually governing begins, and the structural realities that existed before the election reassert themselves in ways that cannot be wished away. Magyar is not Orban. The direction of Hungary is genuinely shifting, but the forces that made Orbanism work for 16 years, energy dependency on Russia, ethnic minority politics in neighboring countries, a population deeply skeptical of foreign-directed reform, and an Orban who will not disappear from the political scene but will organize from opposition, those forces are still present. This is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new chapter, exactly as Magyar himself said, but new chapters contain complications and reversals of their own, and the world would be wise to read them carefully rather than simply celebrate the turning of the page.